Hello, my name is Landon Berger, and I am a second year developmental service worker student graduating from Algonquin College this year. In my free speech and social media elective, I was tasked with making this video on how to deal with the harms of hate speech, misinformation, and disinformation on social media. The best way to deal with the harms of hate speech, misinformation, and disinformation on social media is through government-regulated media literacy education. As an educational worker myself, I firmly believe that education is the solution to most problems, especially when it comes to hate speech, misinformation, and disinformation. This government-provided media literacy education should be free and accessible to all Canadian citizens. Hate speech, misinformation, and disinformation are similar to viruses that corrupt and break down a healthy community. With this in mind, education is the cure, vaccine, or medication that regulates and protects society from the harms of hate speech, misinformation, and disinformation on social media. As stated, the most critical way to deal with the rise of hate speech, misinformation, and disinformation is for the government to provide media literacy education that should start in schools and be accessible to all Canadians after school. Social media education should start early, with classes provided to students on every school board each year during school, and free government programs that postgraduates and adults can easily access. By educating our youth and future generations on the dangers of hate speech, misinformation, and disinformation that they may eventually encounter in their lifetime, we are not only showing them the risks, but also instilling a sense of responsibility to help control and counter hate speech and false information. Social media education will teach them how to respond appropriately and why not to engage in hate speech, misinformation, and disinformation personally, and hopefully gradually eradicate any future base for these to exist on the internet. Lastly, the education the students receive should also teach them how to spot and critically think through the exposure of false information. The social media education that teaches critical thinking for false details should also be easily accessible and free to every Canadian citizen through government programs. When it comes to social media corporations regulating their sites, we can see that they are not doing enough to counter the rise of hate speech, misinformation, and disinformation. Social media platforms like Twitter do not monitor or control hate speech, as it runs rampant throughout the site with the increase of slurs towards Black Americans, Jewish people, and those who identify as gay, since Elon Musk took over in late 2022. Misinformation and disinformation continue to plague Twitter, as it has become a haven for politicians and conspiracy theorists to flex their no limitations on free speech that Elon Musk promotes on the site, even when the misinformation and disinformation harms or promotes violence against minorities. The federal government should step in and take over the regulation of these social media sites by having a zero tolerance policy for hate speech, misinformation, and disinformation. Hate speech targets minorities, vulnerable individuals, and different cultures to hurt them. To protect these individuals' social and mental well-being, the federal government should introduce a zero-tolerance policy and suspend the accounts of individuals actively posting hate speech, misinformation, and disinformation on social media sites. The severity of hate speech, misinformation, and disinformation should determine the suspension with set guidelines. The guidelines for suspension enforced on social media platforms are to be determined by a committee of individuals chosen by the federal government, and what crosses over the severity level of hate speech, misinformation, and disinformation. Overall, I believe the decrease of corporate regulation and increase of government regulation through free media literacy education courses that start in high school and are accessible and free to postgraduates is the best way to deal with the harms of hate speech, misinformation, and disinformation on social media.